All right, welcome everyone. We are very excited for this Diabetes Action Canada webinar today, mainly because it's featuring one of our own, Krista Lamb. So I met Krista Lamb about 2 years ago when she was recommended to me to help out with our DAC communications. I remember when she entered my office, I was immediately impressed with her commitment and interest in diabetes research. Her enthusiasm was so refreshing, it was an easy decision to make her part of the team. Since then, Diabetes Action Canada has become a force on social media, and our name recognition with audiences of all types, from researchers to people living with the condition, has taken off. Krista has been a pleasure to work with, and as part of the team, she does the majority of our communications. This includes all of our news, our social media, and of course, our podcast. And for those of you who don't know, Krista is actually an award-winning podcast producer, so we're very lucky to have her. Also, if you were able to join us for our Insulin 100 event that happened last week, it was a huge commitment, and Krista was a key contributor to that event. So in today's webinar, Krista comes to us as a writer. When she told me she was writing a book on diabetes researchers in Canada, I was wondering if I would know if anyone that was in the book. Well, it turns out that I know quite a few, because many of them are members of our community, both with our Diabetes Action Canada membership and then just others that we work with as collaborators, including our very own Gary Lewis has an interesting chapter himself. So we're excited to now feature this book as part of this webinar. Krista specializes in helping translate complex medical, scientific, and health-related topics into interesting and understandable studies. And this rare skill is demonstrated all throughout her first book, Beyond Banting, From Insulin to Islet Transplants, Decoding Canada's Diabetes Research Superstars. With that introduction, I'm going to now pass the floor over to Krista to start her webinar today. Oh, actually, I'm going to say one more thing. I just want to also tell everyone, I'm sorry, I missed my housekeeping rules. We do have French translation for today's podcast. For today's webinar. The information to access this simultaneous translation is actually in the chat. So if you would like to watch this in French, please do so. We will have time afterward for question and answer. So please feel free to add any questions to the question and answer button on the bottom. The chat is not going to be monitored heavily. It will still be monitored, but not heavily. We do prefer that you do have your questions in the question and answer chat box. All right, now I'm going to pass the floor over to Krista to start the webinar. Thank you, Krista.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm going to turn off the screen here so I don't have to see myself while I'm doing this, because it's very distracting. But thank you to everyone for coming today to check out a little bit more about the book that I've written and to learn hopefully a little bit more about diabetes research in Canada. I am really excited to be able to share the stories of many of the researchers from both Diabetes Action Canada and from across the country. So just a quick disclosure, because I am not a researcher or a scientist, I do work for many organizations, including Diabetes Action Canada, so I always like to make that known. A little bit about me, and Tracy has given you some of this information, but I did want to say a few things in case you haven't seen me speak before or haven't heard one of my presentations. I am one of those lucky people who has the privilege of getting to tell stories about research, and I love it. And I'm so lucky to do a job that I love this much. I am the host and the producer for the Diabetes Canada podcast, which last year won the Canadian Podcast Award for Outstanding Health and Fitness podcast. I also host the Actions on Diabetes podcast for Diabetes Action Canada. And if you haven't taken a listen, I hope you do. It's a lot of fun. And the new season of From Beta Cells to Bicycles from the BC Diabetes Research Network just debuted, and I was able to again host and produce that series. So if there's one thing I like to do, it's talk about research. I'm also really lucky that I get to work with amazing people like Orbis Canada and Orbis International. That's their awesome plane in the picture there. They have the world's only flying eye hospital, which is a surgical eye hospital in an MD-10 aircraft. And it flies around the world helping train people in places where they might not have access to the eye care training. And it supports things like helping with diabetes retinopathy, which obviously is something that means a lot to me. And so I'm going to start today by talking about why I think that telling these stories is so important. Every time I talk to a researcher, they talk to me about how important it is for them to get published. And the focus on publishing is important, but I always think that that's not always the end goal. It's an important goal, but it doesn't need to be the end goal. And I think really with my presentation today, that's sort of what I want to bookend this with, looking at how we can tell science stories in a way that's a little bit different and that helps us reach the goals. Because I think for people outside the science community, and I know this from working on this book and from my other projects, they often have no idea of the incredible things that we're doing within the community. But if they did understand it, it would be a lot easier, for things like funding and for helping people realize the impact of what this work could have. My goal in telling science stories is always to have the person who is listening walk away saying, I didn't know that. Because when you learn something that you didn't know, it can be really exciting and can change how you look at that moving forward. I also think that we spend a lot of time when we're doing research and science communication talking about data, and data is so important. But sometimes we get so embedded with the data and we get so in the weeds with the data that we don't think about how we can tell the story in other ways. And so I use the example in the book. I was watching Dr. Christine Doucette give a talk in BC, and she was speaking to a room full of scientists, and I started to feel really uncomfortable because she's a basic scientist. I understand basic science, but I studied journalism. I don't have that background. But then she put up an image, and it's not this image, but it was a similar image. And she talked about how her work was going to look at how people from Manitoba who lived on the land 100 years ago ate versus how they ate now. So she was looking at the physiology, and the image she showed of what the prairies and what that land looked like 100 years ago, which is basically like a little bit more than a lifetime. That was really inspiring to me because all of a sudden that one image gave me the idea that, wait, this is really important. And I may not be able to understand the really in-depth data, but I can see what the point of her work is and I can understand. So when you're giving a presentation, I often say, what can you be doing that's going to spark that idea, that's going to bring it all together, that goes beyond just putting up a lot of really important data? And I always go back to my mentor, Dr. Jan Hux. When I was working with her, she said to me, is it important in this instance to be accurate or to be understood? And there are times when you need to be both, and there are times when you need to be one or the other. And so thinking of ways that you can make sure that you are accurate, but also understood are really important. I also find that people sometimes say science communication scares me a little bit because I'm not a writer or I'm not someone who could do a podcast. But I always like to talk about how science communication is evolving. And so if you do want to share your science and you do want to do the kind of work that I do, think about the format that might work best for you to do that. These are two of my personal favorite science communicators. Dr. Farah Kasar, who you might know from Twitter and Instagram, is highly active in talking about health and chronic illness, and of course the pandemic right now. This is a photo from her doing an Instagram live for the RCI Science Network. She's finding new and innovative ways to tell her story to the audience she wants to reach. Also doing that is the woman on the other side, Dr. Samantha Yamin, also known as Science Sam. Now, Science Sam really started working through Instagram and Twitter, and now she's incredibly active on TikTok, and she's doing so much work to help people better understand vaccines and vaccine hesitancy, and to help people who are in a different demographic than the one that's being reached by the 6 o'clock news. Because a lot of us will know that the younger generation gets their news from TikTok. And Sam's philosophy is that if we're giving people news that's important, we need to reach them where they are with factual news. Otherwise, we don't know what they're getting. So maybe podcasting isn't something that you're interested in. Maybe you're not going to write a book, but think about ways that you can tell your science stories and reach different audiences. For me, that's been podcasting. This, of course, is the Diabetes Canada podcast. I do the other podcasts as well. But the whole thing for me was finding a way to share these science stories because across Canada, people are doing really important work. And I wanted to find a way where I could do these short segments to tell these stories. But it inspired me to write this book. Now, my background is in journalism. And I never really thought that I would write a book about diabetes research. But the more time I spent working with these researchers and talking to them for 15, 20 minutes about their work, there were so many more questions that I had. And I really wanted to dive deeply into that. So that inspired me to take this idea that I had and to turn it into an actual book. And it was released this March by Rocks Mills Press. And it's been really, really heartening to see how the research community has embraced this project. Now, I'm going to steal from a very popular meme because we all know how it started when it comes to diabetes research. And this year we're celebrating the 100th anniversary of the discovery of insulin. These four men have done some pretty phenomenal things and changed the lives of millions, if not billions of people around the world. And I think we have every right to be exceptionally proud of the fact that they did that in Canada. However, I always think that we forget that how it started is pretty phenomenal, but how it's going is pretty great too. And so there are all of these people who I was able to include in the book, and there are many others, but this is just a sampling of the people I was able to tell stories about who really are making a difference and contributing to the future of diabetes research in Canada. Now, this is a question I get all the time, because if you are a friend of mine or a colleague, you will know that I am someone who loves to talk about diabetes research. And often I'll get the question, why? What is it about diabetes research that is so inspiring to you? Well, as Dr. Dan Drucker said to me when I called him and asked him about doing a book on this topic, he said, we punch above our weight, and we do. If you go to an international conference, you will see lots of Canadians represented in the diabetes research field. Per capita, we may have a small population, but when it comes to diabetes research, we're doing phenomenal things that are influential worldwide. It also started to bother me a little bit that people knew so much about Banting and Best, and they knew nothing about the incredible things that were happening. I remember being in Edmonton for the Diabetes Canada Professional Conference, and I was talking to a woman in a store back when you could do those things, and telling her that I was here for a diabetes conference, and I was telling her all of these things, and I was like, and I'm going to interview the people who did, the Edmonton protocol. She had no idea in Edmonton what the Edmonton protocol was or the impact that it's had on people. And it just made me a little sad that we don't know this part of our history. And I think sometimes when I'm talking to young scientists, another thing I found is that it can be really overwhelming to be a scientist. It can be really challenging to be in your lab late at night working on something and not knowing if it's going to succeed and feeling like, oh, why am I doing this? What is the purpose? And so I wanted young scientists to read some of the stories of what is happening now and what's happened in the last 20, 30, 40 years to really feel that there is importance to this work. That when you're looking at your data and you're exhausted and you're ready to give up, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel and that this work does matter. And even, I think the biggest thing for me is that I'm so inspired every day by the work that is being done. I have the privilege of talking to researchers every day, and I walk away from these stories feeling so inspired, whether it's someone I'm interviewing for a podcast or writing about, they tell me their stories and I'm just blown away. And I want some of that enthusiasm to be felt by others. So now I'm going to tell you a few stories, and these are just a few of the stories from the book because hopefully you'll take a chance on that and check it out. But I could not and I would not have written this book if Dr. Dan Drucker had not said yes when I asked him if I could write about him. To be fair, what he actually said was, I'm a libertarian. You can write about whatever you want, which for those of you who know Dan is a very Druckerian thing to say. However, I say in the book that Dan Drucker is to Canadian diabetes research what Tom Brady is to football. And setting aside what you think about Tom Brady, I think that that is a pretty apt analogy. Dan recently won the Gardner Award, which is sort of the precursor to the Nobels. And he is very deserving of all of that because of Dan, not one, not two, but 3 drugs have been approved for the marketplace to help treat people with type 2 diabetes, or sorry, well, 2 of them are type 2 diabetes and 1 of them is short bowel syndrome. And the 2 diabetes drugs, GLP-1 agonists and DPP-4 inhibitors, have been incredibly groundbreaking when it comes to improving treatment and care for people with type 2 diabetes. And in talking to him, it took me a long time to figure out what story I actually wanted to tell, because there's so much about him. He's the child of Holocaust survivors. He's known for being an absolute machine when it comes to the ability to get things done. But there's so many other things about him that I wanted people to know. I liked how he was so interested in science as a collaborative process. He may have been the person that pushed these things through the finish line, but he's more than happy to tell you about all of the people that worked on these projects along the way. And what really interested me again and again was listening to him talk about the process of making sure that there is access to these medications that he has developed. So when you're a scientist and you're getting your funding, you have an end goal. And with Dan, he started with the one goal, and then he moved it forward and he pushed that ball forward to get it into trials, then to get it into human trials, then to get it into pharmaceutical trials, to get the money for the investments, to do the clinical trials, to show efficacy, to show safety, to show that these drugs could do really interesting things and helpful things for people with type 2 diabetes. And then they were on the market, and he would think, I'm done. But then he realized that people couldn't get access to them because they weren't paid for by the provincial governments. And so he had to look at that process, which is, as a basic scientist, something he had never considered. And so I spoke to Dan a lot about this. And I also talked to Dr. Christopher McCabe, who does a lot of work with CADIT around why medications cost what they do and how coverage is done. And that was a really interesting side of the story that I don't think we understand a lot. We want these drugs to be developed. We want new treatments and cures and medications, but then what happens when they're really expensive? And what happens when a lot of people need to be on them? And so these were all questions that I hadn't considered. And it was, again, going back to that, I didn't know that. And I didn't know that. And so talking to Dan about that process and the work he's done to get people access to this medication was really interesting to me. Also, I try to include a few fun facts for you guys. One of which, and this always blows me away, that Dan didn't want to work in diabetes research. When he got to the lab where he was doing his postdoc at the University of Massachusetts, they said, we don't have any spots for you in that. You're going to have to work in the GLP-1 agonist. He wanted to work in thyroid. And I think every day how much our world would be different if Dan hadn't taken that spot, because there wasn't the one he wanted. I also couldn't have written the book if these gentlemen said no to helping me, because I think the other biggest thing in the Canadian diabetes research field is the Edmonton Protocol. I will not go into the full Edmonton Protocol. It's in the book if you want to better understand it. But basically, the Edmonton Protocol proved that islet transplants could effectively help people with type 1 diabetes to either improve their blood sugar control and potentially to get them off insulin. There are so many caveats to this, of course, but it was the proof of concept that this could actually work that was heralded worldwide as this incredible discovery. And what I found interesting, beyond the fact that there are so many interesting points about that, was that the story is about so much more than these 5 people. It's about more than the 7 people who are on the paper. Dr. Ray Rajotte, who's the gentleman with the glasses in the front row, he worked for decades to get to the point where they were able to do this work. And that doesn't mean he just sat in his lab and did work. He was the one who brought together the team that eventually was able to put this all together to make this puzzle work. He also had to do things like get the funding. Because of Ray's tireless fundraising, the Alberta Diabetes Foundation was formed and continues to exist today, because you cannot do islet transplants in a way that is inexpensive. And he knew that in order to get this work to where it needed to be successful, and also to continue this work today, he needed to have a source of funding. I think anyone who works in research understands that. That also led to the founding of the Alberta Diabetes Institute. If you have the chance at some point to visit, it is a really inspiring place. And it's somewhere where they're now continuing the work of the Edmonton Protocol to try and make sure that the supply and demand situation with islets, as many of you will know, someone has to die and donate their islets in order for them to be transplanted. So obviously, given the number of people with type 1 diabetes and the number of organ donations available, it's not a situation where we can do that easily. However, the work continues because of these projects, the Alberta Diabetes Foundation, the Alberta Diabetes Institute. It's also led to Islet Corps, which is helping scientists around the world get access to human donor tissue. What that means is that when someone donates their islets to the program, but their islets are not viable or their pancreas is not viable for transplant, then those with permission can be used by scientists to actually do work with tissue and with donor organs that they would never have access to otherwise. And that's really helping to move the needle forward. It has been groundbreaking in terms of what it's been able to achieve. All of this happened because of the Edmonton Protocol. And I also want to talk about the patient who said yes, because I think at the heart of all of these major discoveries, we sometimes forget that it's not just the scientists, it's those people. And we know about this with the vaccines for COVID. Somebody has to say yes to taking the chance, to taking the risk to try these things. And I talked to Bob Teskey, who is patient 4 in the the Edmonton Protocol. And Bob is an incredibly resilient and remarkable man. He was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was 14. He ended up in a military hospital where he was in with all the veterans, and he was the youngest person there. And he ended up not just having type 1 diabetes, but he had hypoglycemia unawareness. And so he didn't know when he was going low, and that caused so many issues throughout his life. In university, he was found in a snowbank because he had passed out. And if someone hadn't noticed him and gotten him help, he may have died in that snowbank. He had no idea when he was going low. He became a lawyer, he had a successful career, but again and again, this hypoglycemia unawareness kept kind of coming up again. And at one point, he was a single parent, and his kids had put a baby monitor into his bedroom because they were so worried that something would happen in the night. And so when his endocrinologist called and said, you know how I told you we were out of options? Well, here's this research project, and we don't know if it's going to work, but you could try it. And he said yes. And he's like, tell me where to be and I'll be there. And those are the people who are changing the face of research, because if they didn't have those 7 patients who said yes to trying out the Edmonton Protocol, to being the research subjects, we wouldn't have been able to prove that the Edmonton Protocol could work, and we wouldn't be changing the lives of so many people using that technology. So I always think those are the unsung heroes. And if you're wondering, Bob is doing very well today. He has had 4 islet transplants since his initial transplant. And while he is still insulin dependent, he has much better blood sugar control. He is not hampered by hypoglycemia unawareness. And on some days, his blood sugar is actually better than people who don't have diabetes. So I also spent a lot of time in the book talking to diabetes researchers who live with the condition that they study. And I really wanted to take some time to tell you some stories about them, because I think they are in many ways the unsung heroes of this work. We need people with the condition that we are studying as part of the research process. And that means at the research table as researchers. However, one of the things I noticed again and again and again is that we ask way more of them than we do of others. So for example, Dr. Michael Riddell, he's the gentleman in the without the sunglasses. He is an expert in the area of diabetes and exercise. His work has been world leading. Mike was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was 13 years old. His son was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when he was a teenager. So Mike now has diabetes, researches diabetes, and has a child with diabetes. He also helps to run the DScape program for children with diabetes. He runs the York Sports Camp for kids with type 1 diabetes, and he speaks worldwide. He's written a book about pumps and exercise. He has done so much to help this community. So Desi Zarieva, who is the woman in white below, when she came to his lab and said, I am a martial artist, I am a member of Team Canada, I am a top athlete, and I live with type 1, and I'm researching and studying kinesiology, and I want to become a diabetes researcher looking at diabetes and exercise. Mike sat down with her and she said the most important thing he said to her in that meeting was, you are more than qualified for a role in my lab, but I really want you to think about whether or not you want to work with the condition that you live with 24/7, because you eat, you sleep, you dream, you think about it all the time already. Do you want to work in it? And we're all very lucky because she said yes. And she has gone on to become another leading voice in type 1 diabetes and exercise research. She's now at Stanford. But talking to the two of them about their relationship and Mike's mentorship and just the responsibility that they feel to the community was really, really impactful. And I will also talk about Dr. Bruce Perkins. He's the gentleman in the sunglasses beside Mike. They are very good friends, and they both are researchers with type 1. Bruce was diagnosed when he was 18, and he decided very quickly that he wanted to work in diabetes complications. So for people who live with type 1, most people think, well, you want a cure, right? And if you actually speak with people who live with the condition, they often say, well, we want a cure, absolutely, but what we also need is strategies to help us with our complications right now. Because as Bruce will tell you, when he was diagnosed, he felt very certain that there would be a cure right around the corner. But now, more than 30 years later, he is not so sure, and he works very hard to try and help people using different strategies to improve things like neuropathy for them. The other thing about Bruce that I found really interesting, and it sort of speaks to this idea that we put a lot on them, is that he's also a physician and an endocrinologist. And so the waiting list for people to see him is enormous because they feel like, well, I have type 1 and Bruce has type 1 and he'll understand. And in some ways that's true, but there's always this sense of burden. I don't want to say burden because I don't think he sees it as a burden, but there's this stress that am I doing enough? Am I doing enough for this community? How can I focus on research if I have so many people who need to talk to me or need to see me? And that was a really complicated thing to write about, but I think it's important. And I also included Holly Widowman in this talk. She is a Diabetes Action Canada researcher. She is not in the book, but I think what her work is doing sort of ties in nicely to all of these other stories. And that is trying to get people living with diabetes into the research process, maybe not as researchers, but involved in the process so that they are at every single stage along the way. Holly lives with type 1, and she realized very early in this that a lot of the research done didn't take into account what it's like to live with diabetes. And so she feels very strongly about this. And I think all of the people on this page will feel the same way. It's such an important thing. And because I like to put fun facts, Bruce and Mike were part of a team of people who all live with type 1 diabetes who climbed Mount Kilimanjaro a few years ago. And because they are who they are, not only did they run do this event, Bruce was the medical lead for the team. And then when they got back, they wrote some really interesting papers on insulin at altitude, which I highly recommend if you are interested in those things. Next, I wanted to talk a little bit about the work of Dr. Haider Dean. I will tell you right away that I was not able to get as much into the book as potentially I could, but there is an entire book written about this group. It's called Diagnosing the Legacy, and it really looks at the work that Haider Dean has done in helping to figure out that there was, in fact, a problem with type 2 diabetes with Indigenous youth in northern Manitoba, and her fight to bring that to the forefront. So I wanted to sort of quickly touch on a few different things about this story. One is the importance of integrating a community in research. Dr. Dean, who is the woman in the purple vest, is there with Bertha Flett, and Bertha is the woman in pink. Bertha was such an important part of this process. She's not a physician, she's not a researcher. She is a woman who lived in an Indigenous community where they were seeing these children who were not exhibiting the symptoms of type 1, but who were exhibiting the symptoms of type 2. And Haider felt it was really important that they didn't do work on this community, that they didn't study this community, that they worked with the community in order to find a solution. And that is exactly what happened. And that is only because they were able to work with people like Bertha to make sure that that was how things were done. I also touched on what it's like when people tell you that you're wrong, because Haider was a young female scientist, a young female physician. She had not worked extensively in diabetes, and she was coming to the community and saying, hey, I'm seeing these kids and they're exhibiting type 2 diabetes symptoms. They're not exhibiting any of the symptoms of type 1. This is really weird. And she was told, no, you need more evidence. No, that can't be, you're misdiagnosing people. And she just pushed and pushed and pushed. And I think that tenacity has led to so much of what we know today, because she could have just walked away, but she didn't. She also showed the need for interdisciplinary research. And I tell the story in the book of Dr. Christine Doucette, who is the blonde woman in the corner, and Dr. Brandy Wicklow, who is the woman in red, and how they're working together. Christine is a basic scientist, Brandy is a clinician scientist, and they're really, really working together and putting things together in a way that takes basic science into the clinic. Christine goes into the clinic, Brandy goes into the lab, and they have their areas of expertise, but they're working collectively. They also have Dr. John McGavick, who is an expert in diabetes and exercise, as well as diabetes and mental health. And so all of these people are coming together, and I get the chance in the book to talk about some of the programs that they're working on. I also wanted to touch on the future of Indigenous scholarship. The woman in blue at the top is Taylor Morisseau, and I knew I wanted to talk to Taylor because she's such an inspiration and such an exciting person. But I also kind of went into the interview assuming that she would tell me certain things about what it's like to be an Indigenous scholar, and she blew me away by telling me completely different things. And she reminded me that this is why we need diabetes Indigenous scholars. We need people who understand these communities and these cultures. And Taylor is just one of a number of people who are coming forward to say, we need to have a seat at this table. And she's doing remarkable work because of that. It will also briefly talk about the stem cell superstars. Many of you know that stem cells were discovered in Toronto. You might not know that. If you go down to the Mars building in Toronto, you will see the statue to Till and McCulloch, who are the two gentlemen who are responsible for discovering stem cells. And now we have this collective of incredible scientists who are working to solve things like the problem of supply for islets by creating lab-grown versions. Dr. Christina Nostra, who is in the corner there, is doing some of that work. And I talk in the book not just about the work Christine is doing, which is remarkable in terms of creating beta cell replacements for those that have died off. But I talk also about the bravery of someone who, is a postdoc, and she came from Italy with 2 suitcases to work with Dr. Gordon Keller. And just, I know some of you have done postdocs where you've had to leave the country or you've had to leave, your home to do them. And it's scary, but it's so important. And now she's leading this incredible group of young scientists in Toronto who are very lucky. I also wanted to touch on Dr. Derek Van Der Koey. He's the gentleman in the corner with the gray hair. Derek was not someone I planned to profile in the book. He is super interesting, but he doesn't really focus on diabetes. But I was in his office one day and he was telling me about how his lab had discovered neurons in the pancreas. And I thought, well, that's weird. And he was like, we thought so too. And Derek lives with type 1 diabetes, and he mostly studies neurons, but not in the pancreas. And so when they had this sort of moment of discovery, his lab members came to him and they said, we found this, but it seems weird. And Derek was like, well, maybe we contaminated the sample. There's lots of neurons in this lab. Just try it again. And they did. And they said the same thing happened, and again and again. And so from that, Derek was really excited. I remember how excited he was in his office talking about this, because we don't know what this physiological discovery means, but maybe there's a little bit of that could help others with trying to figure out how we can regenerate beta cells in the pancreas. There's so many things that could stem from this accident. And so I just think it's a really cool part of science that sometimes you make a mistake or you do something that you think is going to have one result and it turns out to have something else that's really interesting. In the book, I also talk a lot about diabetes in women. Those of you who are familiar with science know that for far too long, we did not talk about women when it came to research. We often even did studies just in male mice. So the specific issues related to women and diabetes are very understudied. In the book, I talk about the work of Dr. Denise Fegg, who is the woman in the bottom left corner. She is remarkable for her work with women who have diabetes and helping them maintain better blood sugar control. Women with type 1 and type 2 diabetes have a really challenging life ahead when it comes to pregnancy. And in the book, I tell the story of one of my colleagues who was kind enough to share her personal journey. Her first child, who she had, she's had type 1 since she was 19, and her first pregnancy was pretty it was successful. Everything, went as well as it could. She said she was really stressed out about her blood sugars, but for the most part, she would go home every night and she would relax, and she would, have the opportunity to work on having a successful pregnancy. With her second baby, she said no one had told her what it was going to be like to try and live with type 1, to control your blood sugars and manage a toddler. And she said it was such an eye-opening experience for her, and she had such a different situation. And so research like the one that what Denise is doing, which is looking at things like CGM to help women who are dealing with this blood sugar management, is so pivotal, because as my friend in the book talked about, the mental stress that she was under in dealing with that was so incredibly high and so hard on her, because like she said, there's this back of your mind, I'm going to hurt my baby all the time, and that is really hard to live with. We also have in the book, I talk about Lorraine Lipscomb and Kaberi Dasgupta, who are two physician scientists who are trying to solve the puzzle of GDM. One thing many of you will know is that we don't do a very good job of treating women with GDM. We kind of know how to diagnose them, and we kind of know how to keep them healthy during pregnancy. But then once they leave the clinic, if they don't have diabetes, they're sort of on their own. And I talked to many women with GDM, which is gestational diabetes, as I use jargon. Um, and they said the same thing, that this is something that they didn't even know in some cases, that they were at higher risk for type 2 diabetes. So having programs like the ones that I talk about from Lorraine and Kaberi are really important. And Kaberi actually did a lot of studying to look at the role of the family in diabetes. And that's really the crux of her work, is looking at not just women with gestational diabetes, but also their spouses, because even though there's no genetic connection, the spouses of those with gestational diabetes tend to have a higher risk of type 2 diabetes, which is something that Kaberi found in her research that was really important. Similarly, Lorraine's research looked at the increased breast cancer risk for women with diabetes, which is again something that hadn't really been discussed a lot in the community, because, people with diabetes are at high risk for a lot of things. And it wasn't until Lorraine really looked at the data that she said, okay, there's about a 10% higher risk for women with diabetes to have breast cancer, which is a very small increase. However, if you don't know, you're less likely to get checked. And if you are a woman with diabetes, you tend to miss your mammograms because you have so many other medical appointments that you're dealing with that seem more pressing. So this little bit of research that both of these women were able to do really changed the way that we look at things. And it's only because we started looking at sex and gender differences that we can see these things now. And the gentleman in the corner is Dr. Ravi Ratnakaran, and he's looking at this. He is a clinician scientist as well, but he's looking at gestational diabetes more from, this is the only place where we screen an entire population of women. And so he's looking at that beta cell dysfunction that women with gestational diabetes have, to see if he can learn anything in order to help his work, in which he's doing to try and reverse type 2 diabetes. So all of these little intersects when we start looking at sex and gender in diabetes. And these two, Kylie Peacock, for those of you who aren't familiar with her, is a Diabetes Action Canada patient partner, and she's also an incredible advocate. In the book, she was kind enough to share her story. Kylie was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when she was, I believe, 8 years old. And when she went off to university, she left Ontario to go to Nova Scotia, to Dalhousie, and she was so excited about the prospect of going to university, but also a little scared and worried about managing her diabetes away from home for the first time. And as happens to many young people when they have this experience, she had a hypoglycemia, a dangerous hypoglycemia, and ended up in the hospital. And when she was in the hospital, the situation wasn't great. The physician who treated her was very shaming and blaming to her, and she felt really uncomfortable and really just, left there feeling nervous and even more upset about her situation. And what she said was, she did what so many other young people do, which is she decided to keep her blood sugars artificially high so that she would never go low again. She would never have to have that embarrassing moment where she was the person with diabetes. She would never have to talk to a healthcare professional who treated her the way that doctor had that day. And so she went about that for a while. And those of you who understand diabetes will know it's not a good idea to do that in terms of complications and your overall health. but she was young. And then she finally realized that she needed to get some support for her diabetes, and she went to the Dalhousie Health Clinic, and that's where she was introduced not only to a new diabetes team, but to Dr. Michael Vallis, who is the doctor, the gentleman beside her in the photo. And he looks at diabetes and mental health. And he was the first person that had ever talked to Kylie and said, I understand what you're feeling. If I had diabetes, I would feel the exact same way. What you have is not a pathology. You don't have anxiety, or you don't have something where your fear is out of proportion. If I had diabetes, I would be afraid of those things too. Those fears are real. However, you need to find ways that we can help you to live a healthier life and to get this to a place where you can manage it successfully. And for Kylie, just having someone say, I understand, and you are not out of proportion in what you're worried about, was life changing. She's no longer a patient of Dr. Vallis, but she's gone on to become an incredible advocate for people living with type 1 and supporting their mental health. And it was just one of those stories where what she's doing for the community by sharing her story has made so much impact. Dr. Vallis also talked to me about some of his other work, because he spends a lot of time talking to healthcare providers about how they can better manage the mental health of people living with diabetes, whether it's type 1 or type 2. He's very big on helping them move beyond A1C and looking at what some of the barriers that people are facing are. All of these things are really important. But also right now, there's a real push for type 2 diabetes research that looks at remission, getting people off their type 2 diabetes medications. And what Dr. Vallis talked about was how what's happening is a lot of people see it as a huge success when they get off their diabetes medications. However, when they have to go back on insulin or they have to go back on medications, often for no fault of their own, because diabetes is a degenerative disease, they've been taught that that's a failure. And so he's really looking through his research to try and find ways to help people better understand that, yes, getting off of your type 2 diabetes medications is a wonderful success. But if, because you are facing barriers in your health or in other things, you do have to start insulin, that you can feel good about that, because that's going to improve your health and help you, instead of feeling like you failed. Because when people feel like they failed, they don't do well on the treatment. I also kind of want to go back to what I talked about at the beginning, because I said I wanted to close this loop before I finish my talk, which is about how we can share our science and go beyond just writing a really great publication that gets read by a few scientists who read the journal that you were published in. This is Dr. David Campbell. He is also a Diabetes Action Canada researcher, and his focus is on diabetes and homelessness. And the first time I heard David speak, I was blown away by the work he is doing. He wanted to set aside all the preconceived notions that he had about what it was like to live with diabetes and housing insecurity. And he did that by setting up a focus group full of people who live with diabetes and who are experiencing homelessness. And he was so touched by what he learned from this incredible cohort of people that he was able to speak with. They really changed the way that he looked at the issues that were important to them in terms of managing their diabetes well in pretty difficult situations. I remember talking to him about that and thinking, wow, this is going to be such a cool research paper, which, if you're looking for it, it is. However, David went to this group that he was working with and asked them how they wanted to share their story, which was really interesting to me because it changed the way he was able to share his science. And the result was an exhibit called Home Sweet Homeless. And it's photos taken by people living with diabetes and homelessness that showcase their experience. And I have to tell you, looking at one of the photos, which was of what one of the women had been served for breakfast in her homeless shelter, it really changed the way that I looked at this problem, because suddenly it's like a gut punch that if I had to choose between eating this carb-laden, plate full of food, which is not good for my diabetes, or not eating, what would I decide to do? And so by changing the way that he told his story, he was able to do that publication, but he also was able to really touch the hearts of a lot of people and really have a different type of impact on how we were seeing his research and how we were understanding the stories of the people he was meeting with. Similarly, I wanted to tell the story of Dr. Ahmed Haider. It's one of the stories that I thought was really nice, and it wasn't until people started reading the book and scientists started telling me that this was the one that resonated so much with them that I really took a look and thought about it. Because again, I had asked Ahmed, who works at McGill University, he's an engineer and he's working on the artificial pancreas. I'd asked him what he was most proud of in his work. And most people would tell me about publications and their students, and he felt, that there were many things like that in his own career. But it was really the work that he had done at Camp Carawanis, which is a camp for children with type 1 in Quebec. He had gone there to study the campers. He was part of the program for 2 years, and the campers who wanted to take part in their blood sugar and hypoglycemia awareness programs could be part of that. And he really got to know the campers. But what he also realized was that every night the healthcare staff really struggled because they had to walk all across the camp to try and find out who was having a low blood sugar, who might be in need of support, because they had no way to know without going to each tent. And that could be a very time consuming process because they're not close together. And so Ahmed realized that with his engineering skills, he could actually make a real difference. He could potentially just create a system that would help them see remotely how everyone's blood sugars were doing. And so he decided that, if he didn't do it, no one else was going to do this. It's a local camp. There's no publication at the end of this. There's no, end result that was going to be super exciting for his scientific career, but it meant a lot to him. And so he made the system. He worked with his engineering skills and his students to put this together. And he said the first night that he debuted it and the nurses in the medical tent were able to see that now they could tell who was having a medical incident or to tell who was going low and get to them quickly, that there were tears in their eyes. And he realized how much his science could help with these sorts of everyday issues. I'm going to end by mentioning the next generation, because I think that when I looked at this work, I really was hoping I could write another book at the end of it, because there are so many incredible people who are coming up. And I've spoken to you about a few of them, but here are a few of the others. There are women like Dr. Ananya Banerjee and Dr. Priya Irawima and Dr. Anne-Sophie Brazeau, who are doing incredible work. And in particular, some of the work being done, Ananya's work is with the South Asian community. Dr. Calvin Key, who is right below her, is working specifically in the Chinese community. Dr. Taylor Morrisseau is working in Indigenous communities. All of these young women and men and all of these young folks are doing incredible things, and they're doing them in ways that they are supporting diverse communities who have often been underserved. They are working with vulnerable communities that are often marginalized and not getting the care that they need. And as I see the changes as we move forward, it's just so incredibly inspiring to see all of the work that they're doing and the collaboration that they're sharing. I also really, to share my last fun fact, Priya Irawima, who is a member of the Tim Kiefer Lab at University of British Columbia, actually wrote the afterword for Beyond Banting. She has the very amazing hair in the top left corner. And when I met her, I was just so blown away by her passion for this work and by how she is such an incredible science communicator. And I knew that I wanted her to be a part of this book in a really profound way, because yes, she's working with stem cells, and yes, she's looking at ways to help people who are living with diabetes, but she's also doing so much to further what young scientists are learning. And so that kind of brings me to the end of the stories. Beyond Banting is my book. It is available now wherever you get books. And I hope that you might take a chance to take a look, because this was just really the tip of the iceberg in terms of the stories about the remarkable researchers. And many of them shared their triumphs and their failures and their mistakes. And they were so open and so willing to share their stories. And I'm just incredibly grateful I got to tell them. This is where you can find me if you would like to connect. I'm happy to connect with you on social media and answer any questions today, or if you want to follow up with a question. I also like to end with this photo because I don't get to see my diabetes research community in person anymore, as I know nobody does, but I really miss them, and I am really, really grateful to them and very lucky to have them in my life. So thank you so much, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Krista. I know I really enjoyed that talk, and I'm sure others did as well. And actually, we have a small group here today, and I see that David Campbell has a question with his hand up. So I'm going to allow him to talk so that he can ask it well, as in person as a webinar can be. So I'm going to, I'm just going to get him to get going. Hold on, I lost my participant thing. Okay, so David, you're ready.
Thank you, Tracy, and thanks so much for the presentation, Krista. It's always a pleasure to hear you share the stories. Obviously, it's so well written in the book, but you also bring the stories to life so well. So, Krista, you've spoken a lot about us and the researchers and all these other people, but you haven't spoken too much about your own journey, and I think that's one of the most fascinating things. Is as a non-scientist, non-clinician, to be so interested in diabetes research. It's a pleasure for us as scientists to have people like you who are so interested and engaged in our work. But maybe could you tell us a little bit about your personal journey and kind of what is it that drives you to be so passionate about this work? I think we've heard lots of people speak of your passion and enthusiasm for this, but how did you get to this point?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly wasn't a linear path. As I mentioned, I have my journalism degree, and I actually had planned to be an entertainment reporter. That was my goal, and I wrote for many years as an entertainment journalist, and realized very quickly that that's not a job you want to have if you want to eat regularly. So I decided to start telling different types of stories, and I ended up at a child development research organization where I was taking really complicated PhD level academic research on parenting and writing these stories. And I thought, well, I really like telling these stories. And I realized that it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to write about rock stars. I wanted to just tell these stories. And throughout my career, that's what I've been able to do. But it was really when I found the diabetes community that I started to, I don't know, it just really tugged at me. I went to regenerative medicine for a few years, and I loved them. I loved everybody there, but they would always make fun of me because I wanted to talk about the diabetes regenerative medicine stories and not necessarily all of them. So I think it's just something that when you find where your heart is, it's nice to have that inspiration. So that is my weird story.
Thanks, Krista. You a credit to our research community, and we're very lucky to have you.
Thank you.
So we have another question here from Diana Sharafali. Krista, what surprised you most in writing the book, and what moved you, shocked you?
What surprised me most, I think, is how open people were to sharing some of the things that, weren't necessarily their successes. I think sometimes people, you assume they're just going to tell you all their highlights, and they were often really emotional and really, really just open with me, which I think made for a better book, but also I think made them come alive a little more, and that was great. I don't know what really shocked me. I mean, there were some moments where I was a little surprised, but really, like, there were so many moments. And when it comes to the things that moved me, there were so many times, like, I would leave like one of the offices and just think, wow, like I never thought of it that way. And so, in particular around working with the team with type 1, and I know I talk about it a lot, but it just hit me so hard that we ask them so much and they give us so much, and then they go home and diabetes is their life. And it's just, that really moved me, and it really changed how I see my relationships with them, and also how I see their work and how important their work is.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm going to ask my last question, and it's mine, because I know you actually, I was very privileged to have been invited to the book launch, and there were a few people who did readings. And I was curious, you did highlight some of those stories in today's presentation, but is there one that you didn't highlight that you thought was a really important story, or a really fun story for the research community?
Yeah, I definitely, and I didn't actually highlight it at the book launch, but I've been called out a few times for not including the Gary Lewis chapter in my talks. And it's funny because I love the Gary chapter so much, and I've had so much positive feedback because Gary was so open and so willing to just share everything, and his personality was so magnetic. Like, you just wanted to keep talking to him for hours. And I think the coolest thing with Gary's story is that he shared one of his biggest failures, which I don't think when you have people who are at that level they are often willing to do that. And because he did, I think he did a really great service to young scientists who might worry that, oh my God, I'm new to my career, but I made mistakes. And I thought that was a really important example, and also just really brave of him and kind of him to share that for the next generation who's coming up, that, hey, I got here and I'm at the top of my field, but I didn't do it by being perfect the whole way along.
Well, Krista, I can tell you, I really enjoyed today's presentation, and I know I'm not alone. As always, we'll have this webinar on our website for people to refer to, or to watch again, or to refer to their friends. So thank you for coming today. It was a pleasure, and I look forward to working with you even more as Diabetes Action Canada continues. So thank you to everyone who came today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, guys. I appreciate you coming.